Hi, I'm Claire and this is my reading wrap-up for the last bunch of books that I read in 2017. The first few books I want to mention were rereads. The Frontier Magic Trilogy by Patricia Sirid. The books are called 13's Child, Across the Great Barrier and The Far West, and I got a hankering for rereading these after I mentioned them in my favorite witches video. I really enjoyed rereading these. As with my first time reading them, I really liked F as a protagonist. She's very proactive, she has a strong moral compass, and I also really enjoyed revisiting the world. It's an alternate Wild West with magic and wild magical beasties, which was really cool. However, I did notice this time around though that even though Reedy includes people of color in her narrative and addresses some racial tension and the history of slavery in the US, there aren't any Native American characters in these books or any mention of Native American magic as separate from the other schools of magic that are mentioned. It's especially weird because various characters refer to themselves as Colombian instead of American, so there's a reference to Christopher Columbus, but there aren't any references to Native Americans, and that just feels quite strange to me. Next, I read Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Seanan McGuire. This is the second novella in her Wayward Children series, which is about children who've had adventures in magical realms, coming back to the mundane world and having to readjust to it. I really loved the first book, Every Heart a Doorway, so I was really keen to read this one. Every Heart had more of an ensemble cast, but the next few books focus more heavily on one or two characters. Down Among the Sticks and Bones follows twin sisters Jack and Jill, who grew up in a very restrictive environment, and they have to conform to really harsh standards set by their parents. And then they find a door in their attic room and find themselves in a magical world called the Moors, which is super creepy, very ominous. I love this story. It was a lot creepier than Every Heart though. To be honest, I was way more bothered by the opening of the story and the portrayal of Jack and Jill's awful parents than any of the still quite creepy, like, vampires and mad scientists things that came afterwards. But now I absolutely can't wait for the third book, which is about another secondary character from Every Heart and comes out really soon. I have a pre-order at the moment. Next, I read Ann Leckie's new novel, Provenance. This is a standalone story that is set in the same universe as her Imperial Ratch trilogy, but on a planet that's not massively involved with the Ratchai. I wasn't sure what to expect from this book, but I loved it. We follow this young woman called Ingray, who has been adopted into a very influential family on her own planet. Her mother's a politician, and she expects Ingray and her siblings to impress her at every turn with schemes to raise the family's profile and the family's standing. And in order to do that, Ingray smuggles a convict out of a maximum security prison, except there seems to be a case of mistaken identity. Things don't go quite as planned. Now, I enjoyed this book a lot. It doesn't have the grand epic scale of the Imperial Ratch trilogy. In fact, it's quite an intimate, fairly domestic story when you think about it. I mean, sure, it's set in space and the book culminates in a bit of a heist, and the whole thing does involve a wide-scale conspiracy, but really it's about families. It's about familial love. It's about old families that some characters are running away from, and new families that other characters are forging for themselves. It's about ancestry and memory and what makes the common history of a people or a planet. I really love to see Ingray come into her own in this book and choose her own path by the end, not just making decisions in reaction to her family to please them or to spite them, but for herself. I really enjoyed the secondary characters and the world building as well. That's not exactly surprising. This is an Ann Leckie novel, and as ever, I'm looking forward to whatever she writes next. Next up, I want to talk about Eliza and Her Monsters by Francesca Zappi, which I absolutely loved. I heard about this on one of the Bookish podcasts that I follow, and I immediately ordered myself a copy. It seemed so far up my alley. Our main character, Eliza, is a shy high school senior by day, but by night she is Lady Constellation, the creator of Monstrous Sea, and very popular webcomic with a large active fandom. She's juggling school and her family's attempts to get her into like various sports that they love, as well as writing and drawing the webcomic, and then one day a new kid shows up in school. Wallace is as quiet as Eliza is, but as it turns out, he not only loves Monstrous Sea, but he writes fanfic that is a big deal on the Monstrous Sea forums. I devoured this book in a single day. I started in the morning before work, and then I rushed to it in my lunch break, and as soon as I had done my hours for the day, I went back to it. Once I started, I just had to keep turning the pages. The book was so engrossing. When we first meet Eliza, you have this really stark divide between the world of her parents, who want her to do sporty things and go outdoors, and her teachers, who want her to speak up in class, and then her online life, where she talks to her friend and discusses her favorite show on her forums and makes art that people want to see. And that really painful contrast between the discomfort and the awkwardness with the regular world, and the way that the online world felt so much more comfortable to her, that really resonated with my experience as an awkward teen in fandom, though I personally never made a cool webcomic. A lot of the other tropes that this book played with, like hidden or mistaken identities, I really loved. And then in the second half of the book, once you've been hooked onto the fluffy bits, the tone of the narrative becomes more serious, and there's some discussions of mental health and suicide, which I thought were really well handled. Around this time, I also read a whole bunch of comics, including new volumes of Giant Days and Paper Girls and Descender and more, but I've talked about those in my comic book wrap-up, so if you'd like to hear about those books, there will be links to that video. Next, I read Cat Sebastian's most recent novel, It Takes Two to Tumble. This is the first installment in a new male-male historical romance series called Seducing the Sedgwicks. We follow Ben Sedgwick, a country vicar with an unconventional upbringing, and Philip Dacre, a grumpy sea captain who has some very rebellious children. On her website, Cat Sebastian described it as basically a gay Regency Sound of Music with far fewer children and no musical numbers, and that sounds delightful. I was really hyped for this book because several friends who'd read advanced copies absolutely loved it, and I've really enjoyed the other books that I've read from Cat Sebastian, so I pre-ordered this one, and it was the perfect way to spend a few cozy winter evenings. This felt to me like a really quiet internal story, if I can put it like that. The conflicts that were driving the story, they're mostly conflicts that Ben and Philip are struggling with in themselves, dealing with their own grief, their own notions of who they are and what their duty is and what path in life they should follow. In that way, it felt really different from other romance novels that I've read, bearing in mind that I've not read very many at all. It felt unhurried in a really good way. I was definitely rooting for the characters to find a way to be together that would suit everyone, but I wasn't ever worried about their immediate safety. I just really wanted them to be happy. I also read Almost Midnight, a collection of two very sweet romance short stories by Rainbow Rowell. The first story is called Midnights and is set at the same New Year's Eve party 4 years in a row. It's about Mags and Noel, who meet at this party the first year and then become best friends, and you get to see how their friend group evolves and changes and who they kiss at midnight when the ball drops. The second story is called Kindred Spirits, and it's about a girl called Elena who is determined to queue for Star Wars The Force Awakens outside of her local cinema, even though she has to convince her mom to let her go, and there's only 2 other people in the queue with her, and it's really cold and uncomfortable, and she needs to pee, and she's embarrassed because her mom keeps driving by to check on her every few hours, but she just needs to queue for Star Wars. Both of the stories were really cute. They were fun and lighthearted, and there was some emotions there. These are obviously a super quick read, and this little print edition that I got has some really nice illustrations in it. It's also absolutely adorable and very sparkly. As I've mentioned before, I do love a tiny hardback, and this also comes without a dust jacket. I just really love the way that this edition has been put together. And finally, the last book that I read in 2017 was The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This is of course the best-selling YA novel that was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. It's about a teenage girl named Star who witnesses the death of her childhood best friend Khalil, a young, unarmed black man at the hands of a white police officer. Star's life was already divided between the poor, mostly black neighborhood where she lived and where she grew up, and in the fancy, mostly white suburban prep school that she attends now. But that becomes much harder for her to handle once Khalil's death makes the national news, and she has to decide how involved she should get in demanding justice for Khalil. Before reading this book, I assumed that most of the story would revolve around activism and advocacy, that it would be mostly about Star's public response to the death of this teenager who was unarmed, that she would be doing interviews and leading protests and that kind of thing. And obviously that's a part of the book, but a lot more of the story is about Star's life and how it's affected by this tragedy. It's about her grieving for her friend and feeling guilty for being in school so far away and struggling to relate to her mostly white peers at school who has no idea that she was there when Khalil was killed, and she's struggling to relate to her uncle who she loves a lot, but he's also a cop and he works with the man who killed her friend. It's about the people and the community in Garden Heights where Star lives and the choices that she has to make in order to decide how to stand up for her friend and how to honor his memory and also stay safe herself. I thought this book was sensational. I really loved the way that the world and the characters were drawn. I read it so fast, I couldn't stop, and I also randomly had to put the book down and start pacing around the room for a bit because I was such a ball of nervous energy reading this. I just wanted everything to turn out okay for Star and her family, and you kind of know that is not really ever going to be, you know, okay because someone died. I just wanted to reach into the book and change the course of the story because I can't wait for Angie Thomas's next book, which comes out in 2018, and I also can't wait for the movie adaptation of this. I don't know how I'm gonna feel about watching Anthony Mackie being the bad guy. That does not compute to me. So that's it. Those were the last few books that I read in 2017. I did not make my Goodreads goal of reading 80 books, and in many ways it was not a great reading year for me. But I'm still happy with the books that I read and that I loved this year. Let me know in the comments below if you've read any of these and if you've got any of them in your TBR for 2018, if you've missed them in 2017. If you'd like to see more from me, you can check out a previous video right about here. And if you haven't yet, please hit the subscribe button that's on my face right here for new videos from me every week. I've been Claire, thanks so much for watching, and see you soon. Here's your shot of the cat hiding behind my back.